Hi, welcome to the Child Welfare Lecture on Federal Child Welfare Policy. So, since the early 1800s, legislation has been passed and tweaked to try and address child welfare issues around abuse and neglect, and to give states guidelines to make the best decisions based on the needs of their children and their families. Child welfare has always been an issue that strikes extreme emotions and opinions from all sides of the argument, and oftentimes some of the most significant legislation passed is based on these gut reactions and strong feelings around specific events or issues that arise. And many people in the child welfare world will often talk about how child welfare policy is a pendulum that swings back and forth based on the current events that can cause such a strong reaction, like child death or a terrible abuse story that comes out in the news. And so there are two sides of that pendulum. One is focused really on child safety, no matter what that means. If it means removing children from families, placing them in different homes, different counties, cities, states. The other side is focused on family preservation and keeping families together and offering supports in the families. And so as I talk through some of the most significant federal child welfare policies, you'll notice that most of the policies are connected to one or the other side of that pendulum swing. And you'll also notice that almost all of these laws have been created as a reaction to the law or issue from the previous law that passed. So I'm not going to go into complete detail on each of these laws because that could take us hours, but I will hit the high points of these bills. I've provided a PowerPoint with links to the bills and a little bit of information on each one, and you can find that on D2L. Let's get into it. So in 1935, one of the first major child welfare policies is the Aid to Dependent Children. That was later named to Aid to Families with Dependent Children, or the AFDC. And that was first created as part of the Social Security Act of 35. And it was written by a previous director of the Child Welfare Bureau, and the original function, or Children's Bureau, and the original function was to provide federal grants to states to help mothers with children. So the bill is focused on keeping families together, and it's considered to be one of the first bills written with a focus on the highest social work standards, because it required that they offered personal caseworker services and cash stipends to each family. So the early drafts of the law were frustrating because the participation was made voluntary, and the initial appropriation of the money was cut from $120 to $25, and that was a pretty significant difference for families. For many years, there were different court cases. They challenged parts of the bill, and so by the 1970s, the court had broken new ground by striking down some of the most draconian state provisions that were regulating the AFDC. And at that same time, there was some great improvements made, like they extended for families with two parents when one was unemployed. It extended the age of eligibility to age 18. It extended eligibility to foster children and their custodians. So the laws continued to be amended and adjusted, and it's changed as we've had new social work programs be created, like food stamps and child support and unemployment insurance. And the bill initially was created to keep mothers at home to care for their children. But in our country, we've seen a pretty big shift of views about people who receive welfare in general. And because of those views, the ADFC has changed to move mothers into the workforce instead of keeping them at home with their family. So in Oregon, the ADFC has become what we know today as TANF, and it allows families a pretty limited amount of time to receive services and help, and it places the requirement on the mother or the father, but most of them are mothers, to receive services. They must be doing jobs programs or in school or something like that. So the next bill in 1974 was the Child Abuse and Prevention and Treatment Act, which is known as CAPTA, and it's a pretty significant bill. It was originally acted in 1974. It's been amended many, many times in the past. Most recently, it was amended in 2010. And this bill really shifted towards looking at the safety of children and how government can protect them. And so CAPTA provides federal funding and guidance to states in support of prevention, assessment, investigation, prosecution, and treatment. And the key pieces to this legislation I broke up based on the different amendments. And so I'll quickly go over those so you can see how that bill has changed throughout the history. So the initial bill was passed in 1974. It provided grants to public agencies, tribes, and nonprofit organizations. It authorized the government to do research about child prevention, child abuse prevention and treatment, and it established the Office on Child Abuse and Neglect and the National Clearinghouse of Information related to child abuse and neglect. Then, in 96, it was amended to add some new requirements that addressed problems of false reporting, delays in termination of parental rights, and a lack of public oversight of child protection. It also required an expedited termination of parent rights for abandoned infants, so the kids can quickly get adopted. And it set a minimum definition of child abuse to include death, serious physical or emotional injury, sexual abuse, and imminent risk of harm. And it provided funds to establish the citizen review panels that now exist in every county and review cases every 6 months. And then the last amendments happened in 2012, and those set a standard that reunification is not be provided when a parent has committed intrafamiliar sexual abuse and required them to register as sex offenders. It's encouraged the involvement of families in decision-making processes for the children, whether they're in home, in foster care, or with family. It promotes the adoption of older children and minority children and children with special needs, who are a large portion of the children that we have in care right now. It required notifications for families and relatives when a child enters care. And it also offers grants for improving efforts to increase placement of foster care children legally free for adoption. And as you can see, the bill really takes a look at what can be done to keep children safe. It's focused much more on the system of child welfare, not as much on the community and the family connections. So 4 years later, in 1978, the next significant law enacted was the Indian Child Welfare Act, which is ICWA, and this was created in response to a crisis in the American Indian and Alaska Native American communities. At that time, these communities were facing unprecedented rates of removal for their children. 85% of the children removed were going with families of different cultural backgrounds, and that was extremely concerning to the native tribes of our country, and from that, ICWA was created, and that put federal requirements in place for a child who is a member or eligible for membership to a tribe when they come into the state child welfare custody. So many people have labeled ICWA as the gold standard for child welfare policy, and many of the ideas have actually become best practice in the field overall of child welfare. So in a condensed format, what this law says is that Indian tribes have exclusive jurisdiction over their children, and caseworkers are required to make several considerations when handling any case that has a child who is a member or eligible member of a tribe. So these requirements are that they must provide active efforts to the families, they must provide a placement with a family or other member of the tribe, or an Indian family, or with an Indian family licensed to foster. They must notify the tribe and the parents of all custody and legal proceedings, and they must work actively to involve the tribe and parents in all the proceedings that happen. So ICWA is taken really seriously in child welfare, and there's specific forms that must be filled out. The courts, the citizen review boards, they regularly keep an eye on that to make sure and oversee DHS is following that proper procedure to this day. And then in 1980, a few years later, the Adoption Assistance and Child Welfare Act was enacted, and this was a shift towards family preservation and away from child welfare, keeping children in foster care and keeping them out of home placements. So some key provisions were that this required states to make adoption assistance payments to people who are adopting, which would encourage them to adopt more. It also defined what a child with special needs means. That has to do with funding, and you can get some more funding if a child falls under that category. It also requires that states receiving match funds from federal government make reasonable efforts to prevent removal of a child from the home and must return those who have been removed as soon as possible. It also requires participation in establishing reunification and prevention programs within all the communities. It requires the state to place a child in the least restrictive setting and close to the parent's home. It requires courts to review the child's permanent setting every 6 months, and it requires courts to determine child's future status within 18 months after initial placement, which are both really significant pieces to a child's child welfare case, is how long they're in care and how quickly they're stabilized. So the next bill is going to be the Multi-Ethnic Placement Act, which was passed in 1994. It was originally called MEPA, M-E-P-A, and then later changed to the IEPA, I-E-P-A. So the goal of this was to promote the best interests of children by ensuring they have permanent, safe, and stable families and homes. And I find this bill has an extremely interesting history. It was written by a senator who had a daughter that wanted to adopt a little boy who was from a different cultural background. So the standard practice at that time was that you would give families from the same cultural background first choice in adopting the children, because they believed that children should grow up within their culture and learn about their background. So because of this rule, the daughter wasn't able to be adopted, or the daughter wasn't able to adopt the child that she wanted to adopt. And so in turn, her father wrote a bill that allowed her that ability to adopt. And so the key parts of that bill are that it prohibits states or other entities involved in foster care or adoption placements from delaying or denying a placement based on race, color, or national origin. It prohibits the same entities from denying an individual the opportunity to become foster or adoptive parents based on their race, color, or national origin. And it requires for states to remain eligible. They must diligently recruit foster and adoptive parents who reflect the racial and ethnic diversity of the children in that state who need placement. And it's just, I find it very interesting, since this was actually a case where the legislature only got involved because of personal issues. So the next bill is the Family Preservation and Support Services Program of 1993, and this was a clear swing towards family preservation, as you can see by the name. Some of the key provisions for this are that it encouraged states to use funds and create a continuum of family-focused services for at-risk children and families, and have them engage in comprehensive planning processes to develop responsive family supports and preservation strategies. It also says that states should integrate prevention services into treatment and to preserve services that include activities that are designed to assist families in crisis and support services who are in the system. And they broaden the definition of families so that it can include both biological, adoptive, foster, extended, and self-defined families. The next bill, ASFA, is the Adoption and Safe Families Act. That was passed in 1997, and it was an attempt to correct problems that arose from the Adoption Assistance and Child Welfare Act of 1980. And this is probably the most discussed law in child welfare policy right now, because its effects are being scrutinized and reviewed. Specifically, my office is looking at some issues with the timelines that it creates and how it affects children across the foster care system equally, even though they have different needs, whether they're young, small children, preteens, or teens. This law was a shift away from family preservation and back towards the focus on child safety and health. And some of the key provisions for this one are that it ensured safety for abused and neglected kids by ensuring health and safety concerns are addressed when determining placement. It also added safety of the child to all the steps of the to all steps of the case plan, and it required criminal record checks for foster and adoptive parents. And it does say the states could opt out of that, which is unfortunate. Its next thing, it promoted adoption by providing incentive funds for increased adoptions, and promoted adoption for special needs children while ensuring healthcare coverage for those children. And it prohibited delaying and denying children placement based on their geographic locations. This bill also clarified that reasonable efforts and emphasizing the importance of moving children towards permanency. And the final thing is it required shorter time limits for making decisions about permanent placements by requiring permanency hearings no later than 12 months after a child enters care. And it requires termination of parental rights after a child is in care for 15 out of 22 months, except there are always exceptions if it's not in the best interest of the child or if the child's in care of a relative. It also accelerated permanent placement by requiring states to initiate court proceedings to free a child once they've spent 15 out of 22 months in care, and allowing the child to be freed for adoption quickly in some extreme cases where the family will never get the child back. So our final bill I want to review is the newest child welfare bill that's called the Family First Family First Prevention Service Act, which was just passed this last month, and as far as we know, it can make a pretty significant shift in child welfare policy while it's being implemented. So this bill was included in the larger budget bill that passed Congress in the last few months. It was sponsored by Senator Wyden, Oregon Senator, and Senator Hatch of Utah. And they've been pushing for years to get it passed. It failed, I believe it was last year, and so they were able to get it back in this year. And it's a pretty significant shift in child welfare work, and it puts an emphasis back on family supports. You'll see how we've swung back and forth multiple times. So the key provisions for this is that it allows flexibility when using federal foster care dollars, and this provision will allow money to be used on evidence-based prevention services like parent training, individual and family therapy, substance abuse services, and other in-home services for families. It also encourages foster placements within families by ending federal reimbursements to non-family placement settings like group homes and congregated facilities. It reauthorizes the Regional Partnership Grant that provides funding for evidence-based prevention of child abuse and neglect due to substance abuse. It reduces the amount of time foster children wait to be adopted or placed with relatives across state lines by encouraging the use of an efficient electronic system. And it provides funds to help support family members who unexpectedly assume responsibility for a child by providing caregiving resources, and it eliminates a lot of the unnecessary paperwork that they have. So this feels pretty interesting, and everyone's pretty excited to see how it's going to be implemented. We don't really know yet, but we're hopeful. So this is in no way an exhaustive list of the legislation that has passed for child welfare, but these are considered some of the most significant bills about child welfare. And I'd encourage you to look at the link provided for this week about the Child Welfare Bureau timeline. It's a really great resource to kind of see the whole history of child welfare and be able to dive a little deeper into these child welfare laws. So thanks y'all very much.